Hi, I hope you enjoyed our series on Incomparable, looking at the vision of God in the book of Isaiah. Please let us know how you felt about that. That would be good. But I thought I would just share with you an extra video about something that had certainly came up in my mind as I was looking at Isaiah, and I'm sure probably with you too, because you will be very familiar that much of Isaiah is about the judgment of God on Israel and upon the nations. And there are some quite horrible things that seem to be attributed to God doing them, God in them. I mean, for example, I spoke from Isaiah 42, the beginning part, last week, but actually, if you read to the end of the chapter, you'll find these really sobering and concerning words. It says in verse 25, "So he poured out on them his burning anger, the violence of war." Especially in the current circumstances in Ukraine, we think God is, but with his anger pours out war on Israel. That doesn't sound very nice. Doesn't sound very just. Doesn't sound very loving. But I think if we begin to read the passage and delve a bit deeper into it, we will see some other ways of looking at it. But let's read the bit more of the passage there, Isaiah 42, verse 23. "Which of you will listen to this, or pay close attention in time to come? Who handed Jacob, or Israel, over to become loot, or Israel to the plunderers? Was it not the Lord against whom we sinned? For they would not follow his ways, or they did not obey his law. So he poured out on them his burning anger, the violence of war. It enveloped them in flames, yet they did not understand. It consumed them, but they did not take it to heart." Now, I don't pretend to understand all of this, but here are a few pointers that hopefully you might find helpful. First of all, God is angry at sin because it's destructive in people's lives, and he cares. The opposite of love is not anger. The opposite of love is apathy, that you don't care at all. But it's because God cares that he's trying to do something about it. And he knows that sin is so destructive in people's lives and other people's lives. By that I mean, if we sin, it can affect other people. So in the passage that we read just there, what was clear is because they hadn't followed his ways, that they didn't obey his law. It was something they did. They were responsible. He wasn't controlling it. It was their actions that has brought this activity on them. And then I think also we need to think about that God is incredibly patient, slow to anger, rich in love. We see this again and again. The whole book of Isaiah is about God warning them and telling them that this is what will happen if they keep sinning and they don't follow him. It's not what he wants, and he is patient with them. And he's patient with you and I, fortunately, too. But sin is destructive. Really, this fire and this war is something that they bring on themselves, because sin in its very nature is destructive. If we take non-prescribed drugs, then they are very destructive in our own lives and can affect those people around us massively. And that's exactly what sin does. So let's read a couple of passages in Isaiah where it also talks about this fire coming on people. For example, Isaiah 33:14 says, "The sinners in Zion are terrified. Trembling grips the godless. Who of us can dwell with consuming fire? Who can dwell with everlasting burning?" Again, speaking of God's wrath, I think. But if you go back a couple of verses to verse 11, it says this. It says, "If you conceive chaff, not weeds, bad things, in other words. You give birth to straw. Your breath is a fire that consumes you. The peoples will be burned to ashes. Like cut thorn bushes, they will set ablaze. In other words, the sin, the things that they've done wrong, has brought fire on them. And that's how I think we understand Isaiah 42:25. But also we can see this in Isaiah 9. We probably know well the front bit of Isaiah chapter 9. For us, a son is given, a child is born. But we probably don't know verse 19. By the wrath of the Lord Almighty, the land will be scorched, and the people will be fuel for the fire. No one will spare his brother. Again, there's this fire of God's wrath. But actually, if we go back a verse into verse 18, it says, surely wickedness burns like a fire. It consumes briars and thorns. It sets the forest thickets ablaze so that it rolls upward in a column of smoke. In other words, their own sin has brought this fire of judgment on them. It's worth saying also that the difference between prisoners and captives, Isaiah 42 talks about Jesus setting people free from prison and the darkness. And often our sin brings that darkness on us and we become prisoners, but also sin can make people captives. And that, I think, is what has happened here in Ukraine. It's not that God, because of their sin, that judgment has come upon them, but it's an evil aggressor is making them captives and bringing judgment, and bringing not judgment, but bringing suffering on them. And there are many examples of this. Romans chapter 1 gives it very clearly that 3 times it says that because of their sin, he gave them over to things. And that's how I think God's judgment so often works, is it's because of our own sin. It just brings it on us. And again, this idea of handed over, or God withdrawing his hand, is what so often happens that brings judgment on us. It's not him directly doing things, but because in his patience eventually he says that if he realizes that's not going to bring out the desired result, and so he withdraws his presence. So in Isaiah 42 verse 24 it says that he handed them over. He doesn't actually do it. He's withdrawing his presence so that punishment and discipline comes on them. And that brings me to my next point, that it's out of love that God is trying to bring discipline on the people of God so that they might come to him, that they might change. It's not punishment for punishment's sake. Now, of course, there is a final judgment, but here he is trying to bring people to reform, to discipline, to turn back from their sinful ways and into a place of wholeness. And then finally, maybe these things haven't persuaded you, but what I've learned is that Jesus is the vision of God. Jesus is the full revelation of God. So if there's something in the Old Testament that I don't understand, I'm going to go with Jesus. And I'm going to say that there's something different was going on in that time. Now, clearly, I have only just touched the subject. And if you want to know more, there is 3 good resources, I think. First of all, Sarah Richardson did an excellent talk, a going deeper talk a few years ago that hopefully you can get access to. Secondly, Gregory Boyd has written a 2-volume treatise on this whole subject. It's called The Crucifixion of the Warrior God, and its subtitle is Interpreting the Old Testament's Violent Portraits of God in the Light of the Cross. And there are 2 volumes this thick. They are weighty, and no, I haven't read it all, but there is a more accessible version called Cross Vision that you might find really helpful. For me, these thoughts help me see that God is good, that Jesus is the revelation of God, and he is incomparable, and he is the one to follow. If you found this helpful, please let us know, and we might do more of these in the future. Thank you.